Just starting a little bit early, just getting my bearings. It's a nice day today, about 65, a little overcast, rained overnight, so the ground is a bit boggy, so we won't be moving around much on off the trails today, because the beautiful thing about this park, nothing to do with the battlefield tour, is that when they put the park together, as you can see behind me, they left some drainage areas which then filled in with water and became wetland. So there was actually wetland restoration here as well as the park. So it's beautiful wildlife back here and a little bit of wetland right in the middle of Dundalk. So how are we doing for time? That's my thumbs on front of the camera. What a day, what a day. Yeah, this park hasn't been here long. They really put it together for the tricentenary, no, not tricentenary, the bicentenary, the 200th anniversary of the War of 1812. Did some restoration work down here. Okay, well, let's get started then. Hello, Battlefield Facebook tour. I'm out here at North Point Battlefield in Baltimore County, about 9 miles outside of the city. So I'm in Baltimore County, not Baltimore City, southeast of the city in Dundalk. And we're here to talk about today the Battle of North Point in September 12th, 1814, which is known as Defenders Day in Maryland, unofficial holiday. So this is the Battlefield Memorial Park, as I was just saying, was established for the bicentenary of the War of 1812, so it hasn't really been here long. It's a beautiful park, some wetland areas, some wooded areas, and some walking trails. So if you're ever in the neighbourhood, shove it in your GPS, come on down. So as I said, we're in Dundalk in Baltimore County, southeast of the city. A little bit of Dundalk history. Used to be a big steel mill here, down the road at Sparrows Point, and in its heyday that steel mill employed 30,000 people. So this was a 20th century, this was a place of steel and shipyards and railroads, and that's all gone now. So the steel mill's gone and no one's building ships, and you could think of it as, you know, an ex-industrial, post-industrial area out here in the Baltimore suburbs. Reminds me of that line in The Wire where Frank Sobotka says to Bruce, you know, we used to build shit in this country, sorry, we used to make shit in this country, and it's pretty much the story of Baltimore's industry. We don't anymore. So it's all gone, but I'm really not here to give a history lesson on 20th century Baltimore industrial history and deliver a eulogy for my Union brothers and sisters. I'm here to talk about the War of 1812. So particularly here at the Battle of North Point, as I said, 1814, second year of the war. So this was a clash between British regulars and Maryland militia outside Baltimore. So you could speculate that maybe some of those Sparrow Point steelworkers had ancestors here 207 years ago who fought in the battle. I don't know. It'd be a nice romantic historical fiction if anybody wanted to write that. But let's get to the history. So what I do know is that the Maryland volunteers, those militiamen, stopped the British forces here. It was a superior British force, superior in size, outnumbered the Americans 3-2. So it's superior in numbers, superior in experience and professionalism. They were regulars. But the defeat here inflicted on the British, that halted the British advance into Baltimore, and that bought Baltimore an extra day to improve its defences and deny the British capture of the city. So I want to do a little bit of background maybe on what was the War of 1812, why were British troops here on Maryland soil, were there any events that occurred before this battle that led to it, what happened during the battle, and some of what happened in the aftermath. So, two other tours coming up this month. Just wanted to get a quick plug in for those. I've got a tour coming up at Gettysburg. We're following Dilger's Battery, and I've got a tour coming up at Couch's Bridge, which is a Revolutionary War battlefield. Those will be later in the month, so look on the Facebook page for announcements of those events, and if you want to sign up for those, would appreciate it. Absolutely free. It's all free. So, you know, there's no charge. history joke coming. The only charge would be a cavalry charge, because charge and charge, it's a play on word. Oh, never mind, suit yourselves. So, War of 1812. James Madison is the President of the United States. He's the 4th President of the United States. He served 2 terms from 1809 to 1817. He's only 5'4" tall, hence the nickname Little Jimmy Madison. And Little Jimmy Madison, not a strong president, susceptible to demands from Congress and the factions in Congress. So he ceded to the demands of what we call the war hawks under Henry Clay, the people that wanted war. And as a result of which, Madison compiled this list of grievances which he presented to Congress, asking Congress to address the grievances. And because remember, Congress is the only body in the United States that can declare war. The President can't declare war, he can request Congress declares war. So he sends this list of grievances to Congress, they review it, the House votes for war, the Senate votes for war, and there's a formal declaration of war on the 18th of June 1812. So you might ask, what are those grievances? So there are several. 2 of the big ones were Britain's Royal Navy, in desperate need of men, the largest navy in the world up until perhaps the First World War. So certainly until 1914, the British Navy was the largest navy in the world for almost 2 centuries. So they were in constant need of manpower. And what they would do is, if they were running short of manpower, you'd haul over a merchant ship, send an armed party on board, and start grabbing people and saying, congratulations, you're now in the Royal Navy. It's called impressment. So they were impressing men from merchant ships, and that included American-flagged merchant ships. So that was one of the principal grievances that Madison enumerated. And one of the slogans of the war was like sailors' rights, so that the sailors could not be impressed. America's war hawks under Henry Clay, that body in Congress, were also upset about Britain funding and arming Tecumseh and his Indian Confederation, his indigenous federation, on what was then the western frontier. So we're talking about Ohio, Michigan, Indiana. That was the west, and that was the frontier back in 1812. Those tribes were allied to the British and received funding from the British, and they would attack as British proxies American expansionism in that area. So that was also a grievance, that the British were arming Native Americans. So in addition to what are those legitimate grievances, there's also that mood of expansionism which runs throughout American history. Go west, young man, and rise up with the country. Of course, we don't get that until the 1840s as a saying, but that feeling of expansionism has always been here in America. They landed on the coast, and they just continually, white colonists continually move inland. So there's a feeling of expansion. People are thinking about, well, we could capture some of that British territory up in the Ohio country. Maybe we could invade Canada, which of course they will try to do in the War of 1812. One of the big slogans of the war is "On to Canada." So there's been fighting in Canada. The Americans have invaded. They've marched to York, which is now modern-day Toronto, and burned York to the ground, upsetting the British at no end. There have been battles at places like Lundy's Lane, and the Americans have been kicked out of Canada. And there's also been fighting on that western frontier against Tecumseh. You remember President Harrison, Tippecanoe, so it's Tippecanoe and Tyler too, but it's the Battle of Tippecanoe, and that's a War of 1812. So where were we up to? Oh yeah. So there have been also fights, bringing us to Baltimore, there have been fights between warships at sea. And one of the reasons that Baltimore is significant in that is Baltimore has great shipyards, used to. Shipyards in those days were concentrated down on what's now Fells Point. And they built lots of small merchant ships, and those merchant ships were turned into privateers during the war. So during this time, Britain's been fighting a war against France in Europe, the Napoleonic Wars, particularly in Flanders, Portugal, and Spain. So the British view this war in America as just another front, an inconvenient front in the greater war against France. And because of America's traditional ties to France dating back to the Revolutionary War, they suspect there's some French perfidy behind Madison's list of grievances and the declaration of war on Britain. So in retaliation for the burning of York and the invasion of Canada, the British decide that they are going to pay back the Americans in kind. So they decide that they are going to sail up the Chesapeake, and the Royal Navy under Admiral Cockburn sails a fleet into the Chesapeake, and they sail up and down the Chesapeake, burning towns and looting towns. One of the ones they loot is Havergrace up in Harford County. Hi, Harford County. And they loot that and put the town to the torch. But they're going to bring troops as well. So they bring troops all the way down from Canada, and they land them on the Chesapeake Bay, and they march in retaliation towards Washington, D.C. So outside of Washington, a place called Bladensburg, Maryland, they fight a battle at Bladensburg. The American troops are soundly thrashed. It's mostly militia, very few regulars. There's a last stand by a Marine battalion, US Marine battalion at Bladensburg that enables the rest of the army to escape. They fight like a gallant last stand. But then the British troops march into Washington on the evening of the 24th of August 1814, and they put the city to the torch. So they burn the White House, they burn the US Capitol building. One of the buildings that they incidentally spare is the Marine Barracks 8th and I, still there today, historic Marine Barracks. And that was spared because they recognised that the US Marines had put up such a gallant fight at Bladensburg that, as a mark of respect, they did not torch the American Marine Barracks at 8th and I. Also, it was convenient to have a nice place to set up headquarters, and they used that as their headquarters. So, a mark of respect and also convenient. So they've burned DC, and now they set their eyes on Baltimore. So they're flush with success. So why Baltimore? It's because of those shipyards, and it's because those shipyards are fitting out privateers. So privateers are merchant ships run by civilians that are fitted out as auxiliary warships. So you slap a few cannons on them, you arm the guys on your ship with muskets and cutlasses, and you receive something from the government, a legal nicety called a letter of marque, which says you're acting on behalf of the government, you're allowed to attack enemy merchant ships and seize their loot and bring their loot into port to be sold, and it will be split between you and the government. So the British don't recognise those letters of marque. They regard it as acts of piracy on the high seas, and that they describe Baltimore, it's described in the Times of London, as a nest of pirates. So any of you who have experience of Baltimore politics today will probably consider Baltimore still to be a nest of pirates, but that's neither here nor there. So in September 1814, having just defeated the Americans at Bladensburg and Washington, they decide they're going to transfer their fleet and army further up the Chesapeake and visit the same punishment on Baltimore. So the British troops are under the command of Major General Robert Ross. He's a veteran of the Peninsula Campaign in Portugal and Spain under the Duke of Wellington, and an experienced commander. He's now in command of all the British troops on the East Coast in this campaign against America. So Ross has landed up here by the Royal Navy. He has a strong brigade here. He has about 4,700 men under his command during this battle. That includes the 4th Foot. That's a veteran regiment that's been brought over from Portugal and Spain after fighting Napoleon. The 21st Foot, which is a Lowland Scots regiment, and they call them the North Britons in those days. It's just British politics. For a while there we called Scotland North Britain. So the 21st is, I think, the North Briton Fusiliers. That'll become the Royal Scots Fusiliers. There's the 44th Foot, East Essex Regiment. They're veterans of the campaign most recently in Egypt against Napoleon invaded Egypt for some insane reason. There's no Suez Canal, and there's no real reason to invade Egypt, but he invades Egypt and they fight a battle at the pyramids, and then the British have to send troops into Egypt to expel Napoleon's troops from Egypt. So the 44th are veterans of that campaign. And then there's the 85th Foot. That's another veteran regiment from the peninsula. Admiral Cockburn has also landed some blue jackets, some naval troops to haul naval cannon ashore and become a naval brigade. And there's also 2 battalions of Royal Marines that are on the field that day as well. So these are hard men. These are not soft men, and these are hard men. They've been disciplined by flogging. They've been hardened and toughened by war. They're fueled on rum, and they are looking forward to beating the American forces here in the 3rd successive battle, marching into Baltimore, which they know is a rich and prosperous city, and looting it. So they have a big incentive for winning this battle and letting those men loose in Baltimore. So they are hard men and they want to win this fight. So facing them is a brigade of Maryland militia. So it's the 3rd Brigade of Maryland Militia, known as the City Brigade or the Baltimore Brigade, and that's under the command of Brigadier John Stricker. So sometimes when we think of militia, if you look on the TV news now and you see those alt-right cosplay lunatics in there, I mean, look at me, I'm 300 pounds. If I dressed up in camis and carried an AR-15 and pranced around this battlefield saying, I am the Loyal Militia of Maryland, you'd laugh at me. We're not talking about them, we're not talking about lunatics, and nor are we talking about, some people get a conception of American militia as being backwoodsmen in buckskins like Davy Crockett and they're carrying Kentucky long rifles. Well, that's not who we're talking about. We're talking about volunteers for the militia. They are trained, they are uniformed, they are well equipped, they're equipped just the same as the regular United States Army, and they're trained by the regular United States Army. So think of them more as today's National Guard. In fact, one of the regiments that was here on that day, the 5th Maryland, the Dandy 5th, with history going back to the Revolutionary War and then history going throughout the 18th, 19th century and into the 20th century, where today that regiment that was here on the day, the 5th Maryland, is still continues its lineage in the 175th Infantry, which is Maryland National Guard. So people that fought here on that day as a regiment of National Guard in Maryland, which carries this as a battle honour, carries North Point as a battle honour. So they were properly trained, properly equipped, properly uniformed, and they were militia. And so the regiments that fought here on that day as part of Stricker's brigade, as part of that City Brigade, were the 5th Maryland, the Dandy 5th. They were the... who else was here? 27th, 39th, and the 51st Regiments of Militia. So there's 4 regiments of militia here, and attached to the 5th Maryland was Company of Riflemen, Atkinson's Company of Riflemen. So it's a slightly smaller force than the British. As I say, the British outnumbered them about 3-2. So Stricker has 1 regiment in reserve. He has the 6th Maryland posted about another mile back up North Point Road towards Baltimore. That's covering his rear guard, the single road into Baltimore, through this marshy area. So if he has to fall back, he has somebody guarding the road, and if the British get behind him, he has a rear guard there. So that's the 6th, that's his rear guard. So this straight line behind me is marked out in gravel, and this is to represent, the Park Service put this in, well, the State Park, to put this in. This is to represent the American battle line. Not quite true. The American battle line was actually back there where those houses are. As I say, this area has been developed industrially during the 20th century, so a lot of it has been built on. Part of the battlefield lays over there underneath 695. Part of it lays under here, under the industrial area. And there's only this little pocket of green here that remains. So, on this battle line, the British are coming from behind where those houses are, advancing through woodland and trying to get up this road, North Point Road, to head into Baltimore. Americans are also in woodland here, firing and stopping them. And the troops are getting very close to each other because you can't see each other in woodland. There's not a lot of open ground here at the time, so they close up on each other, firing volleys. So one British officer, Lieutenant George Greig, he described this fight as a personal struggle. Now, at 100 paces, 100 yards, volley fire from muskets, it's very effective. And then also artillery on both sides, firing canister and explosive shell, so it's very effective at close range. But that's not what Greig's talking about. He's talking about a personal fight. He's talking about when those forces can close and the British troops can go in with the bayonet. They can go in with cold steel, and that's a very personal way of fighting. So at times here the fighting did get hand-to-hand and bloody, and if not hand-to-hand, it was barely at 100 yards distance, blazing away at each other with muskets. So early in the battle, the British had dealt a terrible blow. Major General Ross is a field officer, so he's riding on his horse, he's not on foot, so he's way up high on a horse. He's wearing a cockaded hat, a lot of gold braid, he's easily distinguishable, and he is felled by 2 musket balls from the position of the Maryland 5th. So we don't know who fired them. The Maryland 5th claim they did, Atkinson's Rifle Company claim they did, but 2 balls hit Ross and down he falls. He's mortally wounded and he'll die on his way to the rear. They're carrying him back to a surgeon in the fleet, but he'll die before he gets there. So their commander has been killed right at the beginning of the battle. But these are professional soldiers, they don't panic. The next senior officer takes command, and that is Colonel Arthur Brooke of the 44th. So Colonel Brooke takes command of the field and the British brigade here. He's determined to carry on Ross's plan, which was basically to force a passage up this neck, this thin peninsula, to the east of Baltimore and attack Baltimore from the landward on the east. While at the same time he knows that Coburn is sailing into the harbour and will start bombarding the American forts such as Fort McHenry and American defences in the town. So it's a combined attack. The army is coming in from the east while the Navy is bombarding the town from the harbour. So the British and the American forces slug it out here inconclusively for several hours. It's really a delaying action by the Americans. They just don't want to give up the ground. They don't want to inflict an insane victory on the British and drive them back. They know they're not going to do that. But what they want to do is buy time for the rest of the Maryland militia under Major General Smith, who are in Baltimore digging lines of defences, building up earth redoubts, placing cannon to defend the land approaches to the city. So the brigade that's here is holding the ground for as long as they can to give the other troops a chance to organise themselves. Very similar when we talk about Gettysburg, and we talk about the overwhelming Confederate forces who arrive on the first day of Gettysburg, and they are met by 2 brigades of dismounted cavalry who fight a delaying action which allows the rest of the Union Army to come up and defeat the Confederates later on during the battle. So same thing here, the American forces are fighting a delaying action, a squeezing action is what Stricker calls it, here at North Point. So that battle goes back and forth until about 3 in the afternoon, when the 4th Foot move out over here on the British right. So they come up 695 heading towards Essex and John's Pizza. So they're coming up what's now 695, but they flank the American position over there on the British right. So once he's flanked, Stricker knows that maybe the day is lost. The 39th are holding the flank. They fire 1 volley and then they panic because they think they're completely routed, and they run. The 51st are deployed badly. They also fall back, and so now Stricker's entire left is collapsing, and he's only got the 27th and the 5th holding this central position. So he starts falling back towards Baltimore when that flank collapses. Falls back up the single road, passes through his rear guard, the 6th Maryland, and they fight a delaying action into the city. So casualties have been here on both sides. So the British are taking casualties. They will pause to reorganise their forces, get them back in formation. Bandsmen will move the dead to the rear. There was a Methodist meeting house here on this spot that became a field hospital for both sides. So it's common in many battles is that religious buildings, as they have a large by the standards of the day, were large buildings with open space, where often you just move the pews outside and you've got a ready-made hospital that you can just throw straw down on the floor and take your wounded inside. So the Methodist chapel that was here at North Point was used by both sides as a field hospital that day. So after the British have reorganised, Brooke leads them up North Point Road towards Baltimore. It's about 7 miles from this battlefield to the outskirts of Baltimore. And when he reaches there, he reaches what is at that point called Hampstead Hill. It's now Patterson Park. And at Patterson Park, he finds the trench lines that the Americans have dug, some earth redoubts that they've dug. They've been fitted with cannon. Commodore Rogers of the US Navy has brought sailors ashore and guns ashore from ships and placed those as land batteries. And by some accounts, there are 20,000 Maryland militia manning those defensive lines. So that may be exaggerated. That may have included civilians that helped dig the trenches and were unarmed. That certainly included slaves that had helped dig those trenches and were unarmed. Remember, this is 1814. Maryland is a slave state. Slaves were used for military labour during this war. If they escaped and joined the British Army, they would be manumitted, they would be free, and then they would be pressed into a British regiment. So some of these British Marine regiments had escaped African American slaves who'd been freed and were now fighting on the British side in the War of 1812. So that was one way to gain liberty as a slave. If you were a man, you could escape, join the British Army, and get out of the predicament that you were in, although you were then in another predicament as being in the British military. So, Brooke reaches the outside of Baltimore. He meets these lines of defence. It's late in the evening. His army has just fought one battle here and taken casualties, and they've marched on. It is a Maryland hot day. They've been under the sun. They haven't eaten, they haven't drunk water, they haven't drunk enough water. They are exhausted by the time they get to Baltimore. They'd hoped just to march into the city. They can't march into the city, and they know that they don't have enough men and they don't have enough strength or willpower, regardless of them being regulars, to storm those defensive lines and capture the city. So they can either sit there and do nothing and receive cannon fire from the American lines, or they can fall back. And so what they choose to do is to fall back down North Point Road, back down the back bay, and board their ships and leave. So at the same time as this battle is going on, Cockburn sailed his bombard fleet and is bombarding Fort McHenry that guards the harbour, hoping to gain entry to the harbour, and he bombards that all day and all night, and fails to subdue the fort. So the British, in their two-point plan, have failed by land and failed by sea. So the Battle of North Point, pivotally, is their failure by land, and then the Battle of Fort McHenry is their failure by sea. So they've failed to capture Baltimore. So I want to, I guess, think about a couple of things before we wrap up for the day. So one is just to mention that 44th Foot, the East Essex Regiment, that's my home county. Those are my Essex boys. So this is a long way from home. This is a long way from home to come and fight and die. I happen to live here. They didn't. They've been dragged all the way from fighting in Europe and fighting in North Africa, and then dragged all the way across here to the Americas to fight again. It's a long way from home to come and die for your country. I mentioned that several of the American regiments that fought here carried on their lineage in the Maryland National Guard, and several of the British regiments that fought here, because the British would have to rethink their strategy. They weren't going to capture Baltimore, so what are they going to do next? Well, they decided to go down to New Orleans and have a go at capturing that city. So several of the regiments that fought here, including the 44th, would fight again at the Battle of New Orleans in January 1815 and suffer a horrendous defeat there at the hands of Andrew Jackson's forces. But particularly, I want to say that the British failure here at Baltimore, both at the Battle of North Point, where we are, and at the Battle of Fort McHenry, the failures here are really what drove the British to the peace table to negotiate a peace. So the peace is negotiated actually before the Battle of New Orleans. So the Battle of New Orleans has actually been fought after the war is over. They don't know the war is over because you've got to come across another Treaty of Paris. The treaty has been signed in Europe, and you've got to wait for a ship carrying dispatches to get over here and spread the good news that the war is over, and they don't know it yet. And so the British under Packham stupidly attack at New Orleans in the fog against, again, an entrenched position, and are just mowed down in droves there. So, you know, from the British point of view, a pointless battle. And from Andrew Jackson's point of view, a marvellous victory, which will eventually, in the 1830s, propel him into the White House. So, you know, really, if you think about it, the pointlessness of that battle at New Orleans and the casualties at New Orleans is just part of the wider tragedy of this War of 1812, which probably didn't need to be fought at all. If these were grievances over trade and impressment, that could have been negotiated. If this was grievances about territorial and boundary disputes on the western frontier, that could have been negotiated. But you had this pressure from the war hawks for expansionism that kind of propelled President Madison towards war. And so you have these battles in Canada, you have the battles at sea, you have Bladensburg and Washington and North Point, and then eventually you'll have that battle down at New Orleans, which is really just kind of like the bloody icing on a cake of corpses. It's really unnecessary. So that's really what we talk about when we come to a battlefield, is that, you know, we talk about this unit was here, this is where the 44th were, this is where the 5th were, this is where the 21st were, this is where the 27th militia were, this is where the 1st Foot were. We talk about where units were and where they moved and what their flags look like, and this flank movement and this retrograde movement. And we talk about that. We talk about the generals who won, because those are the guys that wrote the memoirs. Ordinary soldiers did not really write memoirs. So we have the letters from officers and we have memoirs from senior officers. That's what we talk about. And we don't talk really about the ordinary people that fought on these battlefields and bled to death on these battlefields, sometimes thousands of miles from home. And really, when we tour these battlefields, we need to pay more attention. There's nothing on this battlefield that mentions the casualties on this battlefield. There is a plaque that mentions the field hospital, but there's nothing to mention the numbers that died here, the names of any ordinary soldiers that died here, which, from a historical point of view, it's probably there in primary sources somewhere, but that it's not commemorated here. This is just commemorated as like, oh, there's a victory, here's a Maryland flag, here's an American flag. You know, Stars and Stripes flies alongside the Maryland state flag over there in this beautiful park where they've restored wetland, and there's some walking trails, and there's a few markers around, but, you know, people died on this ground, and we don't often think about that when we're at a battlefield. I mean, it might be a little bit morbid, but, you know, maybe we should think about that more. Maybe we should think about the fact that when we're touring these battlefields, that people actually died here, and that maybe that's something that we shouldn't be doing again, that we, you know, war is a bloody stupid idea, and that maybe we should study it so we know how stupid it is and we don't do it anymore. Anyway, so that's enough of me and my politics. I'll probably post some book recommendations later on Facebook, post some maps maybe. I will find some primary sources when I get around to it from home, and eventually get around to posting those online. But other than that, thanks for coming out today. It was a nice day. I'm standing in the shade because I don't want to get the sun on me. I do have water today, but that's back in the car, so I didn't want to get too hot. And so that was the Battle of North Point, September 1814, War of 1812. Thanks for coming out. Thanks for walking the ground with me today. I would have loved to have walked a little bit more on the ground itself, but it's a little bit wet underfoot. And I don't want to stray too far from the paths, because this wetland is beautiful, restored. So there's another patch of it here with reed in it. You know, that's habitat for turtles and terrapins and frogs and all sorts of things. And I don't want to disturb that by clumping around in my size 11 boots. So, you know, hopefully when we get to Gettysburg next week, I think, we'll have a drier day. Be able to get out and tramp around up there on, I think we'll be on Barlow's Knoll. So look in the Facebook group for other tours that are coming up. Thanks for walking the ground with me today, and I will see you another day. Thank you. And of course we're now like, hey David, how do we finish this damn thing? Ha 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 ha. Mr. Technology can't work his phone.